The town of Red Hollow sat beneath a wide, unforgiving sky, where the sun burned hot in the day and the wind whispered through empty streets at night. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful from a distance wooden storefronts, a quiet saloon, a church bell that rang every Sunday. But beneath that calm surface lived something far heavier. Fear. People in Red Hollow had learned long ago that keeping your head down was the safest way to survive. Clara moved through the town like a shadow no one wanted to notice. Every morning before the sun fully rose, she could be seen hauling water buckets from the well, her hands rough and red from labor. By midday, she worked at the ranch on the edge of town, mending fences, tending animals, doing whatever was demanded of her. By nightfall, she was still working, cleaning, carrying, fixing until her body nearly gave out. No one could quite remember when it had started. Some said Clara had arrived with her family years ago, hopeful and smiling. Others whispered that after her parents passed, she had no choice but to work for the man who owned most of the land around Red Hollow. That man was Mr. Caldwell. He wasn't loud or reckless like some men of power. He didn't need to be. His control was quiet, steady, and absolute. He owned the largest ranch, supplied goods to the stores, and had a firm grip on the town's decisions. Even the sheriff seemed to think twice before crossing him. And Clara belonged to his world. No chains held her. No locks confined her. But everyone knew she wasn't free. If Clara slowed down, Caldwell noticed. If she made a mistake, Caldwell reminded her, sometimes with cold words, sometimes with public humiliation that made the townspeople shift uncomfortably but say nothing at all. That was the worst part. The silence. At the general store, Clara would carefully count coins, buying only what she absolutely needed. The shopkeeper, an older man with tired eyes, would watch her quietly. Sometimes it looked like he wanted to say something, offer help, perhaps, but he never did. Instead, he would simply take her money and nod. At the well, women would gather and talk in hushed voices. Their conversations would fade the moment Clara approached. They would offer polite smiles, but never more than that. Never a question. Never an outstretched hand. Even in the church, where kindness was preached every Sunday, Clara sat alone on the back bench. The pastor spoke of compassion and courage, but no one seemed to carry those words beyond the doors. Red Hollow had become a town of watchers. They saw everything. They just chose not to act. Clara never asked for help. That was something people noticed too. She kept her head lowered, her voice soft, her movements careful. It was as if she had learned that drawing attention only made things worse. But there were moments, small, fleeting moments, when the truth slipped through, like when she paused at the edge of the well, gripping the rope just a little too tightly, her shoulders trembling before she steadied herself again, or when she thought no one was looking, and her expression changed, not just tired, but something deeper. A quiet kind of sadness mixed with determination. As if she refused to let herself completely break. Those moments stayed with people. They lingered in the minds of the townsfolk, long after Clara walked away. Yet still, no one stepped forward, because in Red Hollow, fear didn't shout. It whispered. It told the shopkeeper that helping Clara might cost him his business. It told the sheriff that it could create trouble he wasn't ready to handle. Told every man and woman in town the same thing: stay out of it and you'll be fine. And so they did, day after day. Clara carried her burdens alone while the town carried something just as heavy, guilt they refused to face. The wind would sweep through the streets in the evening, lifting dust into the air as the sun dipped low behind the hills. Doors would close, lamps would dim, and Red Hollow would settle into another quiet night, unchanged. But beneath that silence, something was building, because there is only so long a town can look away before someone finally refuses to, and when that day came, Red Hollow would never be the same again. The first sign of change came quietly, so quietly that most of Red Hollow almost missed it. It was just past noon when the stranger rode in. The sun hung high, pressing heat into the earth, and the town moved at its usual slow pace. A few men lingered outside the saloon. The general store door creaked open and shut as customers came and went. Dust drifted lazily through the air. Then came the sound, steady, unhurried hoofbeats. Heads turned, not out of curiosity, but habit. In a place like Red Hollow, newcomers were rare enough to notice, but not important enough to question. Most folks took one glance and then returned to their business. But not everyone. The rider sat tall in the saddle, his silhouette sharp against the bright sky. His hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes, and his coat carried the marks of long travel dust, sun, and miles of road behind him. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing loud or attention-seeking, and yet something about him didn't fit. He wasn't tense like most strangers entering unfamiliar territory. He didn't scan the street like he expected trouble. Instead, he moved with a calm awareness, as though he already understood more than he should. His name was Elias. He guided his horse down the main road at an easy pace, taking in the town without appearing to stare. His gaze passed over the buildings, the people, the small details others ignored. And then he saw her. Clara stood near the well, pulling up another bucket of water. The rope strained under the weight, and so did she. Even from a distance, Elias could see the effort in her posture, the way her shoulders tightened, the way she braced her feet just to hold steady. For a brief moment, she paused, catching her breath. No one moved to help her. Two men stood nearby, talking about cattle prices. A woman adjusted her shawl and turned away. Life continued as if Clara were invisible. Elias slowed his horse. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No sudden realization, no sharp reaction. Just a quiet shift in his attention, as if something had clicked into place. He watched as Clara lifted the bucket, water sloshing over the edge, soaking into the dry ground. Her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied them quickly and began to carry the weight away. Still, no one stepped forward. Elias's gaze lingered a second longer before he nudged his horse onward. He dismounted outside the general store, tying the reins loosely to the post. The bell above the door rang softly as he stepped inside. The shopkeeper looked up, offering the same polite nod he gave every customer. "Afternoon," Elias returned the nod. "Afternoon." His voice was even, calm, nothing about it demanding attention. He moved through the aisles slowly, picking up a few basic supplies. But his focus wasn't entirely on the shelves. "Quiet town," he said after a moment. The shopkeeper hesitated just slightly before replying. "We like it that way." Elias glanced toward the window, where the street stretched out under the sun. "Seems like more than just quiet." The shopkeeper's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. "You passing through?" "Maybe," Elias said. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was enough to end the conversation. The shopkeeper rang up the items without another word. Outside, the town carried on as usual, but Elias noticed the small things others ignored. He saw how conversation shifted when certain names were mentioned. He saw how people avoided looking toward the ranch road at the edge of town. And he saw Clara again. This time, she was walking past the storefronts, carrying supplies that looked too heavy for one person alone. Her steps were steady, but slow. Determined, but worn. As she passed, a group of townsfolk fell silent, not out of respect, out of discomfort. Elias leaned lightly against the post outside the store, watching. There was a pattern here, a rhythm to the silence. People weren't just ignoring Clara, they were choosing to, and that choice told him everything he needed to know. A Man stepped out of the saloon and caught sight of Elias lingering. He gave him a once-over before muttering, "Best not to get too curious around here." Elias didn't look away from the street. "That so?" the man shrugged. Town runs smoother when folks mind their own business. Elias considered that for a moment. Then, almost to himself, he said, "Sometimes that depends on what you call smooth." The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked off, leaving the words hanging in the warm, dusty air. Elias straightened, adjusting his hat slightly. He had ridden through plenty of towns before, places with their own rules, their own unspoken understandings. But Red Hollow felt different. Here, the silence wasn't just habit. It was protection, and it was breaking something. His eyes drifted once more to the road, where Clara had disappeared. Most men would have taken the warning, finished their business, and ridden out by morning. It would have been the easy choice, the safe choice. Elias exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up his supplies, untied his horse, and instead of heading out of town, he turned toward the direction of the ranch. Not in a rush, not with anger, just with quiet certainty. Because whether the town realized it or not, something had just arrived in Red Hollow that wasn't willing to look away. By midday, the heat had settled over Red Hollow like a heavy blanket. The town moved slower under it, voices quieter, footsteps dragging just a little more than usual. But the ranch, sitting just beyond the edge of town, never slowed. Work there followed no comfort, no mercy, only expectation. Clara had been on her feet since sunrise. By now, her arms ached, her back burned, and dust clung to her skin like a second layer. Still, she kept moving. There was always more to do. Always something waiting. A section of fence along the far end of the ranch had come loose, and she worked carefully to mend it, her fingers steady despite their weariness. The dry wood creaked as she tightened the wire, her focus locked on finishing the task properly. "Taking your time again?" The voice cut through the air sharp, controlled. Clara's hands paused. She didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. She knew who it was. Mr. Caldwell approached at a measured pace, his boots pressing firmly into the dirt with each step. He carried himself the same way he always did, calm, composed, certain that everything around him belonged exactly where it should, including her. "I'm finishing it," Clara said quietly, keeping her eyes on her work. Caldwell stopped a few feet away, observing the fence as if inspecting it for flaws that hadn't yet been made. "You said that yesterday," he replied. Clara swallowed lightly. "The post was weaker than it looked. I had to redo part of it." Caldwell tilted his head slightly, considering her words, or perhaps deciding how to respond. "And whose fault is that?" he asked. Clara didn't answer. There wasn't a right answer. A few ranch hands stood nearby, pretending to focus on their own tasks. They weren't close enough to be involved, but they were close enough to hear, and like the rest of Red Hollow, they stayed silent. Caldwell stepped closer, his presence pressing into the space around her. "You're here to work," he said evenly, "not to make excuses." "I'm not making excuses," Clara replied, her voice still soft but steady. It was a small thing, but it was enough. Caldwell's expression shifted, not dramatically, but just enough to reveal his displeasure. Then, "Perhaps you need reminding," he said. Clara's grip tightened slightly around the wire, not in defiance. In preparation, but before Caldwell could say anything further, a new voice entered the moment. "That fence looks solid to me." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every person within earshot felt it. Caldwell turned slowly. Elias stood a short distance away, one hand resting loosely near his belt, the other hanging relaxed at his side. His posture wasn't aggressive. His expression wasn't angry, but there was something unmovable in the way he stood, something that didn't belong to this place of quiet obedience. Caldwell studied him for a moment, measuring. "You're new," he said. Elias gave a small nod. "Passing through." "Then I suggest you keep passing," Caldwell replied. "This doesn't concern you." Elias glanced briefly at the fence, then at Clara, and finally back to Caldwell. "Seems like it concerns anyone standing close enough to see it." A ripple of tension moved through the air. The ranch hands shifted uneasily. One of them stepped back, creating just a little more distance from the scene. Caldwell's gaze sharpened. "You don't know how things work here." Elias didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a single step forward, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to make his presence clear. "I know what I see," he said. The words were simple, but enough to make his presence clear. "I know what I see," he said. The words were simple, but enough to make his presence clear. They landed heavily. Clara's heart pounded, though her face remained composed. She wasn't looking at either of them now, her eyes fixed on the fence. As if staying still might somehow keep the moment from escalating. No one moved. The wind passed softly through the dry grass, carrying dust between them. Caldwell let out a quiet breath, his patience thinning. "This is my ranch," he said, his voice tightening just slightly. "My responsibility. My decisions." Elias nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement. Then he spoke. Calmly, clearly, double coat enough. The word hung in the air. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't forced, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said before. The entire ranch seemed to pause around it. Even the smallest sounds, the creak of wood, the shift of boots, faded into the background. Caldwell stared at Elias, surprised not by the word itself, but by the fact that someone had dared to say it at all. Not in private. Not quietly. But here. In the open, where everyone could hear. For a moment, it seemed like something might break, that the fragile balance Red Hollow had lived under for so long would finally snap. But Elias didn't move, didn't reach for anything, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, unwavering, and somehow that made it harder to challenge him. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He glanced briefly around at the ranch hands, at the distant figures watching from the edge of town. For the first time, the silence didn't feel entirely on his side. It felt uncertain. After a long moment, he stepped back. Just one step, but it was enough. "We'll discuss this later," he said to Clara, his tone colder now, more controlled. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. The tension didn't disappear immediately. It lingered, stretched thin across the space between everyone present. Clara exhaled slowly, though she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. Her hands were still steady, but something inside her had shifted. She looked up. Elias was already turning away, as if the moment required no acknowledgement, no reward. But before he left, his eyes met hers briefly, not with triumph. Not with expectation, just quiet reassurance. And for the first time, the line that had always gone unchallenged had been crossed. It didn't crash through the streets or announce itself with noise, so quietly that at first no one was sure it was happening at all. The morning after the confrontation at the ranch, the town looked the same as it always had. The sun rose over the same rooftops, the same doors opened. But beneath those routines, something had shifted. People were thinking. And in a place like Red Hollow, that alone was enough to start something. Clara noticed. At first, in the smallest of ways. She approached the well at dawn, as she always did, expecting the same long, solitary effort. The rope hung still, the bucket resting at the bottom, waiting. But as she reached for it, "Let me." The voice was hesitant, almost unsure of itself. Clara turned. It was one of the women from town, the same one who used to fall silent whenever Clara came near. Today, she stepped forward, her hands. "You don't have to," Clara said softly, instinctively. The woman offered a faint smile. I know. The words echoed something Clara had heard before. Before she could respond, the woman began to pull the key. The woman began to pull the key. Rope, her movements not as practiced, but determined nonetheless. For a moment, Clara just stood there, watching, trying to understand. Thank you, Clara said, her voice quieter than usual but steadier. The woman nodded, as if the act required no further explanation, and maybe it didn't. Across town, the changes continued. At the general store, the shopkeeper moved with a new kind of purpose. When Clara stepped inside later that morning, he didn't wait for her to approach the counter. He met her halfway. I set a few things aside for you, he said, placing a small bundle gently in front of her. Clara hesitated. I can pay. It's already taken care of, he replied, a little more firmly this time. There was no avoidance in his gaze now. No looking away. Just quiet resolve. Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. Behind her, another customer shifted, watching the exchange. But this time, no one turned away. Even the ranch began to feel different. Work continued, of course. It always did. But the air had changed. The ranch hand spoke a little more openly, not loudly, not boldly, but enough to be noticed. When one man was given an unfair task, another stepped in to help without being asked. When Clara moved to lift something too heavy, someone else reached for the other side. No announcements were made. He stood outside his office, watching the town with a thoughtful expression. For years he had convinced himself that keeping the peace meant avoiding conflict. That silence was the same as stability. Now he wasn't so sure. He had heard about the ranch. He had heard about the cowboy, and more importantly, he had seen the way people were beginning to act. The balance of Red Hollow wasn't as steady as it once seemed. It was shifting. And for the first time, he wondered whether that might not be a bad thing. If anything, he seemed to step back even more, allowing the town to move on its own. From his place near the Benzinder edge of the street, he watched as Clara walked past, carrying supplies. This time, she wasn't alone. A young boy walked beside her, holding part of the load with both hands, determination written across his face. Clara said something to him, something light enough to bring a small, genuine smile. It was brief, but it was real. Elias noticed, and that was enough. Not everyone welcomed the change. There were still those who kept their distance, who whispered that things were better the way they had been, that stirring trouble would only lead to consequences. And maybe they were right, because change, even quiet change, has a way of drawing attention, especially from those who stand to lose the most. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of amber and gold, Red Hollow settled into the evening. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. This silence felt different. It wasn't built on fear alone. It carried something else now. Something growing. Hope. Clara stood outside the small place she called home, looking out at the town as the last light faded. She could feel it, not just in others, but in herself. A shift. A strength she hadn't allowed herself to hold on to in a long time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't complete. But it was there. And once something like that begins, it doesn't easily disappear. From across the street, Elias prepared his horse, tightening the saddle with practiced hands. He glanced once more at the town, at the people, at Clara. Then he looked toward the open road beyond Red Hollow. For a moment, it seemed like he might leave. Like his part in the story was done, but he didn't move. Not quite. Because change had begun in Red Hollow. And now, it would be tested. Morning came to Red Hollow with a quiet kind of clarity. But everything had. It wasn't written on the buildings or carved into. It wasn't something you could point to in a single place. It lived in the way people moved, the way they spoke, the way they no longer looked away. Clara stepped out onto the porch of her small home, pausing for a moment as the cool air settled around her. The weight she once carried, not because the work ahead had disappeared, but because something inside her had shifted for good. She walked into town at her usual hour, her step steady, her gaze lifted just a little higher than before. And this time, people met her eyes. A woman passing by offered a small smile. Clara returned it. But before she could lower the bucket, two others stepped forward. "We've got it," one of them said. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." At the general store, the door opened before she even reached it. The shopkeeper stood inside, already setting aside what she needed. "Morning, Clara," he said. "Morning," she replied. No hesitation, no distance, just a simple exchange between equals. Different. But there were no sharp corrections echoing across the fields. He hadn't disappeared, but something about him had changed. Or perhaps something around him had. He moved through the ranch without the same unquestioned authority. Conversations no longer stopped when he approached. People continued their work, aware but not afraid. Respect, where it existed, was no longer rooted in silence. It had to be earned, and that changed everything. Clara worked alongside the others, her hands steady, her posture open. When a task proved too heavy, someone stepped in not out of obligation, but because that was how things were now, shared, balanced, right. At one point, she paused, looking out across the land. For so long, this place had felt like something she endured. Now it felt like something she belonged to, not because it owned her, but because she had claimed her place within it. Across town, a familiar figure prepared to leave. Elias tightened, the straps on his saddle, his movements calm and unhurried. His horse shifted slightly beneath him, ready for the road ahead. He glanced once more at Red Hollow, at the people moving through its streets, at the life returning to it in a way that felt real. He hadn't come here to stay. That had never been the plan, and now there was no reason to change it, because the town no longer needed someone to stand for it. It had learned to stand on its own. As he guided his horse toward the edge of town, a voice called out behind him. "Elias," he turned. Clara approached, her step sure, her expression calm. There was nothing urgent in the silence, nothing unfinished, just acknowledgement. Clara considered that, then gave a small understanding smile. "Yes," she said, "it does." She looked back briefly at the town, then returned her gaze to him. "Thank you," she added. The words were simple, but they carried everything that had changed. Elias tipped his hat slightly. "You did the hard part," he replied. Clara shook her head just a little, not alone. Elias didn't argue, but he didn't take the credit either, because they both knew the truth. He had started something, but she had made it real. A soft breeze moved through the street, carrying dust and light together in the morning air. For a moment, it felt like the town itself was holding its breath. Then Elias gave a small nod, turned his horse, and rode on. No grand farewell, no lingering glance, just a quiet departure like his arrival. Clara stood there for a moment longer, watching until he disappeared beyond the rise. Then she turned back toward Red Hollow, toward the life waiting for her. The town carried on, as all towns do. Work continued. Voices filled the streets. The rhythm of daily life moved forward. But beneath it all, something lasting remained. Not fear, not silence, but courage. The kind that doesn't need to shout. The kind that grows in small moments, in steady choices, in people who decide one day that enough is enough. And in Red Hollow, That choice had changed everything. Because sometimes, all it takes is one voice to break the silence, and one town willing to finally listen.